Pull your chair closer to the fire and let the sounds of the modern world fade away. We are stepping back through the mist and the centuries to a time when the fate of nations was written not in ink but in blood and fire. Our chronicle of the most wanted begins not with a king upon his throne, but with a man who became a legend in the wild, rain-lashed hills of Scotland. A man whose name became a battle cry and a nightmare, William Wallace. To understand the fury of Wallace, you must first feel the weight of the boot upon Scotland's neck. The year is 1296. The great Scottish king, Alexander III, is dead, his line extinguished. The kingdom of the Scots, a proud and ancient nation, teeters on the brink of civil war, a prize ripe for the taking. And into this power vacuum strides a man who believed it was his divine right to rule all of Britain. Edward I of England, a monarch of immense ambition, iron will, and a ruthlessness that would earn him the moniker Hammer of the Scots. He did not come as an ally, but as a conqueror. He seized the Scottish royal regalia, the stone of destiny, and demanded the fealty of every Scottish noble of note. He humiliated them, subjugated them, and left his garrisons to rule the land with a fist of iron. Scotland was not a neighbour, it was a possession. It is onto this stage of smouldering resentment that William Wallace enters. Born around 1270 into the minor landed gentry in Elderslie, he was not a man of high royal blood. His was a life meant for local concerns, managing his family's lands, perhaps serving as a knight in a minor lord's retinue. He would have been expected to drink his ale, pray in his local church, and keep his head down. But the world had other, more brutal, plans for him. The spark that lit the inferno is shrouded in the fog of legend, but its heat is undeniable. The story goes that English soldiers, asserting their authority with casual brutality, confronted Wallace. A quarrel escalated. They killed his wife, Marion Braidfute, or in some accounts, his entire family. This personal, searing loss was the microcosm of Scotland's national agony. Where another man might have been broken by grief, Wallace was forged by it. His sorrow did not turn inward. It exploded outward in a storm of vengeful fury. He didn't seek a lawful remedy. What court would hear him? He became the law of the wild. He tracked down the soldiers responsible and slaughtered them. This was not a political calculation. It was a primal scream. And in that scream, hundreds of disenfranchised Scots heard their own voice. From a lone avenger, he quickly became a symbol, a catalyst. He was the rebellious uncle who shows up at a somber family gathering, throws open the doors, and shouts, "Enough! Who among you has the spine to fight?" His legend grew with each ambushed supply wagon, each burned English outpost. He was a phantom of the glens, a story told in whispers. But phantoms do not win kingdoms. Armies do. Wallace's moment to prove he could command more than a guerrilla band came in September of 1297, at a place that would become sacred ground, Stirling Bridge. Picture the scene with me. The air is chill with the promise of autumn. The River Forth, wide and sluggish, loops before the town of Stirling. The only crossing is a narrow wooden bridge, so slim that only 2 horses could cross abreast. On the north bank, Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew de Moore, waited. Their force was a motley assembly, hardy Highlanders, lowland spearmen, fierce clansmen armed with their long, wicked axes. They were farmers and craftsmen, not professional soldiers. Across the river, the English army under the command of the Earl of Surrey was a vision of medieval might. Thousands of heavily armoured knights on barded war horses, ranks of longbowmen and disciplined men-at-arms. They were confident, contemptuous. To them, this was not a battle. It was a policing action. The English vanguard began to cross, the bridge groaning under the weight of their pride and steel. Wallace and Moray held their men in check with an iron discipline that stunned their enemies. They watched, they waited, as more and more of the English force shuffled onto the narrow span and the boggy ground on the Scottish side. They let the noose be tied by the enemy's own arrogance. Then, when the critical mass was committed, when the bridge was choked with men and the vanguard was isolated, they gave the signal. It was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. The Scots did not charge. They erupted. They fell upon the confined English vanguard like a force of nature. The schiltrums dense, bristling hedgehogs of long spears proved impervious to the cavalry charges that had won England its empire. Knights, trained for the open field, were impaled in the press, their horses screaming. The English longbowmen, devastating at a distance, were useless in the close-quarter chaos. The bridge itself became a death trap, as Scots hacked at the supports and English soldiers, packed together, were pushed into the river to drown in their heavy armour. The Earl of Surrey, watching the carnage from the south bank, ordered the bridge destroyed behind his own men to save the rest of his army. He fled, leaving thousands of his best men to be butchered. The waters of the Forth ran crimson. It was more than a victory. It was a national catharsis. Wallace had not just defeated an army, he had slain a myth of invincibility. In the aftermath, Wallace was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. For a glorious, fleeting year, Scotland was free, and Wallace was its unchallenged leader. But Edward Longshanks was not a man to accept humiliation. His rage was a cold, calculating thing. Wallace was no longer a nuisance. He was the personification of Scottish resistance, and he had to be erased. The hammer of the Scots returned in 1298 with a vast, seasoned army, hell-bent on revenge. The two forces met at the Battle of Falkirk. This time, the open field favoured the English. Their longbowmen, used to devastating effect, rained death upon the Scottish schiltrums, and the English heavy cavalry found their opening. It was a crushing defeat for Wallace. His military reputation was shattered. He resigned the guardianship and returned to the shadows from which he came. A ghost once more, waging his private war of attrition against the English occupation. For years, he remained a spectre, always one step ahead of the countless patrols sent to find him. He was the most wanted man in Britain, his price enough to make a pauper a prince. But every ghost, in the end, can be betrayed by the living. In August 1305, Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to Edward, captured Wallace near Glasgow. The prize was secured. He was bundled in chains and dragged south, a trophy for a vengeful king. His trial in London's Westminster Hall was a grotesque parody of justice. He was crowned with a garland of oak leaves, a mocking tribute to the King of Outlaws. The charge was treason. Wallace's defense was brilliant in its simplicity and legal truth. I cannot be a traitor, for I have never been Edward's subject. My allegiance was always to the King of Scotland and to my country. I have done nothing that I would not do again to defend my homeland. It was a speech for the ages, but it fell on deaf ears. The verdict was never in doubt, guilty. And in the world of medieval kings, a verdict of treason demanded not a mere death, but a ritualized, public dismantling of the body and the spirit. The sentence was pronounced: you are to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. On the 23rd of August, 1305, the spectacle began. Wallace was dragged through the jeering streets of London for 4 miles, face down in the filth and offal. At the Elms of Smithfield, he was hanged from a gallows, but cut down while still clinging to life. Then came the true horror. The executioner opened his belly, pulled out his entrails, and burned them before his eyes, the ultimate penance for a traitor's soul. Only then, as a final mercy, was his heart cut out. Finally, his body was decapitated and quartered, hacked into 4 parts with a butcher's axe. The rebellion was to be dismembered with the man. His head was tarred and impaled on a spike atop London Bridge. His right arm was sent to Newcastle, his left to Berwick, his right leg to Perth, his left to Aberdeen. They were displayed in town squares as a grisly, rotting warning. This is the fate of those who defy the crown. But a legend, once born, is harder to kill than a man. The pieces of William Wallace were scattered, but his story coalesced. He became more than a man. He became an idea. To Scotland, he was the martyr whose sacrifice proved that freedom was worth any price. To England, he was the cautionary tale of a subject who refused to be subjected. And to us, across the centuries, he is the eternal reminder that in the Middle Ages, the journey from obscurity to icon to a dismembered warning on a city gate could be as swift as it was brutal, and that the hammer of a king, no matter how mighty, could not crush the spirit of a people ignited by one man's defiant stand. Let us now leave the sunlit battlefields and royal forests behind and descend into the mist-shrouded, waterlogged world of the fens. We are turning our gaze to a different kind of rebel, a master of a terrain so hostile and alien that it became a character in his story. His name was Hereward the Wake, and his saga is not one of pitched battles, but of a prolonged, stubborn, and brilliantly frustrating war of shadows, fought not on solid ground, but in the ever-shifting, sucking embrace of the swamp. To understand the depth of Hereward's defiance, one must first feel the cataclysmic finality of the year 1066. The Battle of Hastings was not merely a change of monarchs. It was a systemic, cultural, and political annihilation of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. William the Conqueror, a man of relentless will and strategic genius, did not come to share power. He came to possess, to erase, and to rebuild in his own image. The Harrying of the North, a campaign of such systematic brutality that it left whole regions of Yorkshire desolate for a generation, was a clear message. Resistance is death. Norman lords, speaking a clipped Romance tongue, were installed in the great halls of the slain Saxon thanes. The very landscape was rewritten, with wooden Matanbally castles springing up like poisonous mushrooms, symbols of an alien power imposed upon the land. It was into this world of smouldering resentment and shattered pride that Hereward, born around 1035 into the Lincolnshire gentry, returned. His early life is a tapestry woven with threads of trouble and exile. Chroniclers paint him as a wild, ungovernable youth, his spirit too large for his station, his temper too quick for peace. He was cast out from his family, becoming a sword for hire, a wanderer who honed his martial skills in the brutal schools of Flanders and across the continent. He was, in essence, tempered in fire, far from home, and when he finally returned to his ancestral manor, born around 1070, he was a hardened warrior, a man out of time, returning to a home that was no longer his. The scene that greeted him was a deliberate insult to his lineage and his identity. A Norman lord, likely a petty knight rewarded for his service at Hastings, now occupied his father's hall. The familiar rhythms of Saxon life, the laws, the customs, were being supplanted by the harsh cadences of Norman French and the arbitrary dictates of a foreign aristocracy. The humiliation was personal, immediate, and visceral. For a man of Hereward's temper, there could be only one response. It was not a calculated political move, but a primal explosion of rage. Gathering a small band of loyal housecarls and local men whose bitterness matched his own, he stormed his own home. The attack was swift and merciless. The Norman garrison was taken by surprise and slaughtered to a man. It was a point of no return, a crime for which there was no pardon, no fine, no reconciliation. With that single act of violence, Hereward transformed from a disinherited son into a symbol. He was the spark in the tinder-dry kindling of Saxon despair. His genius, however, lay not in the act of rebellion itself, but in his choice of sanctuary. He fell back to the Isle of Ely, a vast, trackless expanse of marshland in Cambridgeshire. This was not a fortress in the conventional sense. It was a living, breathing, and deeply hostile ecosystem. To the Normans, with their reliance on heavy cavalry, siege engines, and organized formations, the fens were a tactical nightmare. The ground was a treacherous semi-liquid plain of peat and clay, where what appeared to be solid land could give way in an instant, swallowing a horse and rider in a ghastly, bubbling grave. The waterways were a labyrinth, their channels shifting with the rain and tide, known intimately only to the local fenmen, a hardy, independent people who lived by fishing, fowling, and harvesting the reeds. Hereward did not just hide in this landscape. He fused with it. He became the spirit of the fens. His stronghold was not a wooden palisade, but the impenetrable thickets of reed and sedge, the hidden meres, and the fog that could cloak 1,000 men in moments. His followers were a ragtag parliament of the dispossessed, exiled thanes who had lost their lands, bitter farmers whose strips of arable land had been seized, outlaws with nothing left to lose, and the native fenmen who viewed the Normans with the same suspicion they reserved for any outsider. Their life was one of perpetual dampness. They lived knee-deep in mud, their clothes permanently sodden, their skin a tapestry of insect bites. The air hummed with mosquitoes the size of pigeons, and the nights echoed with the strange cries of bitterns and the constant, squelching symphony of the swamp. From this watery lair, Hereward waged a masterful campaign of guerrilla warfare. His tactics were those of the phantom. His men, using lightweight, shallow-draft boats, could glide soundlessly through the waterways. They would materialize from a bank of fog, launch a volley of arrows into a confused Norman patrol struggling on a causeway, and then vanish before a counterattack could be organized. They mastered the art of the ambush on the narrow, hidden paths, where Norman numerical superiority was nullified, and the fight devolved into a brutal, close-quarters melee in the mud. After each strike, they would melt back into the reeds, their laughter, a sound of mockery and invincibility carrying across the water to torment their heavily armored, earthbound enemies. The legends that swirled around him were a crucial weapon in this psychological war. It was said he possessed a bear's strength and a fox's cunning. One famous tale recounts how he disguised himself as a simple, ragged potter, his face smeared with mud, and walked brazenly into the very heart of the Norman camp at Peterborough, selling his wares while eavesdropping on their plans and memorizing their fortifications. Another, more fantastical story claims he was confronted by a monstrous bear, a beast set upon him by his enemies, and he wrestled it into submission with his bare hands, breaking its neck and earning the awe of all who witnessed it. Were these stories true? It matters little. In an age where reputation was a currency as potent as silver, these tales were propaganda of the highest order. They painted Hereward not just as a man, but as a force of nature, a folk hero touched by destiny, protected by the very land he defended. William the Conqueror was not a man accustomed to being mocked. His initial response was one of grim practicality. He sent offers of pardon, hoping to lure the Wake from his swamp with promises of restored lands and royal favor. He understood that a reconciled Hereward would be a powerful symbol of Norman magnanimity. But Hereward, trusting neither the king nor the future he offered, refused. His defiance was absolute. This refusal provoked the full, terrifying weight of Norman wrath. William himself marched at the head of a vast, professional army, determined to do what his subordinates could not: drain the swamp of this insurrection. The king's approach was a spectacle of imperial power. He brought engineers, siege weapons, and a fleet of boats. His most ambitious project was the construction of a massive causeway, a great timber and fascine road thrust into the heart of the marshes, a bold attempt to turn Hereward's aquatic fortress into a solid battlefield of the Normans' own choosing. It was a breathtaking display of will and resources, but the fens and the fenmen fought back. The Wake's followers, under cover of darkness and mist, sabotaged the works. They would attack the labor crews, burn the wooden frameworks, and, according to legend, even persuaded the local monks, initially sympathetic to the Saxon cause, to pray for the causeway's failure. The great structure, a testament to Norman engineering, slowly sank into the insatiable mire, a tangible symbol of William's frustration. The final act, as it so often is in tales of resistance, was one not of military defeat, but of betrayal. The Normans, realizing that force alone was futile, turned to gold and persuasion. They found their instruments among the monks of Ely Abbey, men whose loyalty was perhaps strained by years of privation or swayed by promises of protection and wealth. These monks knew the secret, sacred paths through the marshes, the one vulnerability in Hereward's aquatic fortress. For a price, they agreed to guide a crack force of Norman knights along these hidden trails under the cover of a moonless night. The attack was a thunderclap. While the main rebel force was distracted or asleep, the Norman knights, led by their treacherous guides, emerged from the very reeds that had been their prison. They fell upon the heart of the rebel camp. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The fight was desperate, chaotic, and brutally one-sided. The screams of men mingled with the clash of steel and the panicked cries of women and children. The rebellion was gutted in a single bloody night, its lifeblood seeping into the peat from which it had sprung. But the hero, the embodiment of the legend, had to escape. And so Hereward vanished. His fate is the subject of enduring mystery, a blank space on the map that invites the imagination. Some chronicles suggest he fought his way through the cordon of knights, a demon in the gloom, and eventually, years later, a broken and weary man, secured a grudging pardon from a king who could not help but respect his tenacity. Others claim he fell in that final melee, his body lost in the chaotic press, never to be found. But the most powerful, the most fitting end, the one that truly cemented his legend in the hearts of the Saxon people, is that he did not die at all. That he, like the spirit of the land he defended, simply retreated deeper into the endless, trackless fens. That he remains there, still a ghost in the mist, a whisper on the wind, forever laughing from behind a curtain of reeds at the king who conquered all of England but could never conquer the swamp, nor the stubborn, indomitable spirit of the man who called it home. To the Normans, Hereward the Wake was a criminal, a terrorist, a persistent and maddening irregularity in the neat feudal order they sought to impose. To the broken Saxon nation, he was the last free Englishman, a beacon of impossible hope, a reminder that the old spirit was not entirely extinguished. To historians, he is a tantalizing puzzle, a man whose life is a palimpsest, where hard fact and fertile myth are forever intertwined, as impossible to separate as water from the peat of the fence he so brilliantly defended. He proved that to be the most wanted, one did not need a crown or a castle. One needed grit an intimate bond with the land and the sheer unyielding will to make the most powerful man in Europe feel for a glorious, frustrating moment that he was losing a perpetual maddening game of hide-and-seek in the immortal, impenetrable mud. Let us pull up a chair by the fire once more and journey back to a different kind of rebellion. Not a national uprising in the misty Highlands, but a deeply personal feud born in the courtly halls of power and fought in the wild, lawless borderlands between England and Wales. This is the story of Fulk FitzWarin, a man who looked his king in the eye, saw a petty tyrant, and decided that if he couldn't have his birthright through law, he would take it through legend. Before we begin, a moment, if you will. Draw the curtains. Let the modern world fade, and, in its place, picture not the broad, heather-clad fields of Scotland, but the rugged, rain-swept marshes of the Welsh border in the closing years of the 12th century. This is a land apart, a buffer zone of mist-shrouded valleys, impenetrable forests, and formidable stone keeps. Here, the authority of the English crown is a distant whisper, often drowned out by the clash of local rivalries and the ever-present threat from Wales. Loyalties here are as shifting as the bogs, and a man's word is only as good as the strength of the sword at his hip. It is in this crucible of conflict that our story unfolds the tale of a lord who became a legend not for leading a nation to freedom, but for waging a magnificent personal war against his own anointed king, Fulk FitzWarin. To understand the white-hot fury that would define Fulk's life, you must first grasp the treacherous political landscape of the Angevin court under King John. This was a monarch who possessed a keen, administrative mind, but it was overshadowed by a bottomless capacity for suspicion and spite, a man who trusted no one and, in turn, was trusted by none. For the powerful barons of England, dealing with John was a perpetual, deadly dance on a knife's edge. A single misstep could mean ruin. Fulk, born around 1160 into the proud and battle-hardened Marcher nobility of Shropshire, was raised from infancy in this world of simmering tension. His entire identity was tied to a single, stark claim, the lordship of Whittington Castle. But a castle in the Marches was more than a noble's residence. It was the very source of his power, the symbol of his family's honor, and a legacy made manifest in unforgiving stone. It was his soul, written in rock and mortar. The trouble began not with a dramatic battle cry, but with a cold, bureaucratic betrayal. When Fulk's father died, the young heir, well versed in the feudal contract, dutifully presented himself before King John and offered the substantial relief of £100 to secure his rightful inheritance. But John, a virtuoso of financial and political manipulation, saw not a loyal subject, but an opportunity. In an act of breathtaking perfidy, he accepted Fulk's money and then, with the stroke of a pen, granted Whittington Castle to a Welsh rival, Moerig of Powys, who had flatteringly offered the king only half the sum. It was more than a simple injustice. It was a calculated, public humiliation designed to break a man's spirit. The message was as clear as it was cruel. Your lineage, your honor, your very name, means nothing before the king's whim. Where a more cautious lord might have seethed in silent, dignified protest, Fulk's temper, forged in the proud, martial culture of the Marches, ignited into an inferno. He had tried to play by the king's rules. Now he would tear up the rulebook entirely. His response was not a politely worded petition. It was the drawing of a deep, uncrossable line in the earth. By 1201, the crown officially declared Fulk an outlaw, a wolf's head, a term that placed him outside the law, a man whom any could hunt and kill like a beast. But Fulk was no common criminal lurking in the shadows. He was a disinherited lord, and he took to the dense woods and hidden valleys, not with a ragtag band of peasants, but at the head of a well-armed company of over 50 men. his brothers, his cousins, his most loyal knights and tenants. They were not merely hiding, they were garrisoning the wilderness, turning the ancient forest into their personal fortress. From these natural strongholds, Fulk waged a relentless and brilliantly audacious guerrilla war. He became the spectre of the marshes, ambushing the king's tax collectors, diverting the royal revenue into his own coffers, waylaying supply trains, and harassing royal patrols until they were afraid to leave their castles. He was the noble robber baron, systematically stripping the crown of its wealth, and, far more importantly, its precious dignity. His name became a story told in whispers, spreading from smoky taverns to great stone keeps, a tale of the man who dared to defy the king. The legends that grew around him, immortalized a generation later in the vibrant prose of the romance Fulk FitzWarin, added a rich layer of personal vengeance to the dry tinder of the political feud. They say that, as a boy, Fulk was a ward of the royal court, forced into the company of the young Prince John. The story goes that during a tense game of chess, the spoiled, petulant prince, enraged at his impending loss, snatched the heavy chessboard and struck Fulk across the face. Fulk, with the fierce, untamable pride that would define his entire life, did not cower. He retaliated with a kick so powerful it sent the royal heir sprawling, his head cracking against the cold stone floor. When the weeping prince ran to his father, the great Henry II, to demand punishment, the old king, a formidable judge of character, instead chastised his own son for his poor sportsmanship and lack of honor. The grudge, the story insists, was seared into John's soul in that moment. Years later, as king, he would steal Fulk's castle as his ultimate, long-awaited revenge. Whether this childhood tale is factual or a literary embellishment matters less than its profound truth. It perfectly captures the essence of their conflict, a deeply personal clash of characters between a man of rigid honor and a king of festering resentment. The most famous legend of his outlaw years tells of a time when King John, indulging his passion for the hunt, was lured deep into the woods, bordering Fulk's domain by a grimy, simple-minded charcoal burner. This lowly figure, head bowed in false deference, promised to lead the king to the most magnificent stag he had ever seen. The king separated from the bulk of his retinue in the thrill of the chase, followed eagerly only to be led into a secluded clearing where the charcoal burner straightened his back, wiped the soot from his face and revealed the steely eyes of Fulk FitzWarin. Surrounded by his men, emerging from the trees like apparitions, Fulk did not kill the king. Instead, he took him captive, forced him to sit and feast at his hidden forest camp, and made the King of England swear a solemn oath on the scriptures to restore Whittington Castle. It was the ultimate humiliation. The sovereign, captured by his own subject and forced to barter for his freedom like a common merchant. And true to his nature, John later broke his oath, adding another layer of bitter betrayal to a conflict that was now intensely, irrevocably personal. For 3 long years, Fulk was a persistent, maddening splinter in the thumb of a king who was already grappling with restive barons and a crumbling empire in France. Fulk was besieged in his forest fastnesses, hunted by the crown's best men, and even, at one point, forced to flee by sea, a pirate lord on the waves. Yet, he could not be caught. He was a phantom, sustained by the support of the local people who saw in him a champion against a despised king. Finally, in late 1203, with his attention and treasury desperately needed for the looming war to save Normandy, King John pragmatically decided the game was no longer worth the candle. The cost of hunting Fulk outweighed the cost of forgiving him. A royal pardon was issued to Fulk and over 30 of his followers. In 1204, the crown finally, formally relented, and Fulk FitzWarin, 3 at last took lawful possession of Whittington Castle, his birthright. He had won it not through obsequious, courtly petition, but through sheer, stubborn, glorious defiance. He would live on for decades more as a respected, if always formidable, marcher lord, founding Alberbury Priory perhaps in penance for his violent past, and dying an old man, full of years and honour, in his own bed, not on the executioner's block or a forgotten battlefield. To the crown, he was ultimately a recalcitrant baron who had been pragmatically brought to heel. To the common people of the marches, he was a folk hero, a man who had stared down a tyrant, and won, proving that even a king's will could be broken by a will of iron. And to history, he stands as a powerful, historical precursor to a more famous, mythical outlaw. A real-life nobleman whose very personal war for justice against the villainous. King John created a blueprint for the legend of Robin Hood. Fulk FitzWarin proves that sometimes the most wanted man in England is not a peasant in the greenwood, but a lord who has been pushed too far and who discovers that in the wild, lawless heart of the land, that man can make himself a king of his own conscience.